What is up, YouTube? I'm Ace Palomero, South Texas Realtor, proud son of the Rio Grande Valley, and when I was still with Starbucks, work mom's biggest headache. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to discuss unemployment, inflation, supply and demand, and how all three of these tie into the housing market. Let's get this rolling. At the suggestion of Starbucks mom, I made a PowerPoint. Now she'll probably give me crap for this later, like, oh, now you listen to me, but whatever. At the very least, this is helping me keep organized as I make this video. Alright, let's get this rolling. So once again, we're going over unemployment, inflation, supply and demand, and how they tie into the housing market. Just definition, we're going to go over the August unemployment report and its significance on the economy. So to be considered unemployed, and this is according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, someone who is unemployed is jobless, looking for a job, and available for work. So to be considered unemployed, you would have to meet all three of these criteria. The Employment Situation Summary released by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that for the month of August of this year, unemployment went up to 3.8%. This is an increase of 0.3% from the previous month of July. So the total number of unemployed individuals rose by 514,000 to 6.4 million, and that's higher than last year's 6 million. And the industries that trended up were leisure and hospitality by 40,000, social assistance by 26,000, and construction by 22,000. Industries that trended down were the transportation industry and the warehousing industry, together going down by 34,000 jobs. And industries that had little change were the professional and business services, information industry, and mining, quarrying, oil and gas, manufacturing, wholesale trade, retail trade, financial activities, other services, and government. Why this matters. The unemployment rate is one of the main things that the Fed is looking at when deciding on monetary policy. Let me read you this quote from Fed Chairman Jerome Powell from last November. Policies to support labor supply are not the domain of the Fed. Our tools work principally on demand. Without advocating on any particular policy, however, I will say that policies to support labor force participation could, over time, bring benefits to the workers who join the labor force and support overall economic growth. Such policies would take time to implement and have their effects, however. For the near term, a moderation of labor demand growth will be required to restore balance to the labor market. And he continues. Currently, the unemployment rate is 3.7%, near 50-year lows, and job openings exceed available workers by about 4 million. That is about 1.7 job openings for every person looking for work. So what I took from that is the unemployment numbers at that time, the speech was in November 2022, were not at the levels that would make the Fed reverse course on their monetary policy. And I don't see how the current 3.8% unemployment rate would make the Fed reverse course either. For context, right before the recession of the early 1980s, unemployment was at 6% and went up as high as 10.8%. Right before the great financial crisis of 2007-2008, and saw the house prices in many metros crash, the unemployment rate was 5%, and it went up to 10% in October of 2009. Since unemployment is still low, this signals to the Fed that it's fine to continue keeping the interest rate or the interest on reserve balances and the discount rate high, which keeps the federal funds rate high. And this keeps the rates that banks charge consumers, us, high. And these rates include auto loans, lines of credit, and mortgage rates. Real quick, let's go over some definitions. The interest on reserve balances is the interest paid on funds that banks hold in reserve balance accounts at their Federal Reserve Bank. Essentially, this is a risk-free option for banks. So this is the lowest rate a bank will be willing to lend on its funds. This interest is an administered rate, meaning the Fed sets it. The discount rate is the interest charged by the Fed for loans it makes through the Fed's discount window. This is effectively a ceiling for the federal funds rate, since banks are unlikely to borrow at a higher rate than they can borrow from the Fed. So if the discount rate is the ceiling, then the interest on reserve balances acts as the floor. And finally, the federal funds rate is the rate at which commercial banks borrow and lend their excess reserves to each other overnight. Once again, the federal funds rates increasing means that it becomes more expensive for banks to borrow from other banks. And these higher costs will likely be passed along to consumers via higher interest rates on lines of credit, auto loans, and mortgages, like I previously mentioned. Oh, that thing about banks borrowing from other banks, right? So by law, banks have to have a certain percentage of their deposits in an account at a Federal Reserve Bank. And you guessed it, the Fed sets this reserve requirement. So a bank that has an excess in these reserves can lend that money to banks that might not have enough to meet this reserve requirement. Now this graph is from FRED, or the Federal Reserve Economic Data. And I had adjusted it so it shows the unemployment rate from 1970 until this year. But you can actually go as far back as 1948. And let me get that pointer in there. You can see right there, record low unemployment. Let's talk about inflation. So I took the 3 definitions that were at the top or near the top of the Google search results. Investopedia says that inflation is a rise in prices, which can be translated as a decline of purchasing power over time. Seda, owner of International Money Fund, defines it as how much more expensive a set of goods and services has become over a certain period, usually a year. And the U.S. Department of Labor has inflation defined as the overall general upward price movement of goods and services in an economy. Inflation is measured by changes in CPI, or Consumer Price Index. CPI is a measurement of the average change over time in the prices paid by urban consumers for a market basket of consumer goods and services. The basket of goods is essentially what the government thinks the typical household buys. The data for this basket of goods and prices paid for each item is gathered by surveys of businesses and surveys of households. And there is a time lag. To give an example of this time lag, the Bureau of Labor states on their website that the CPI data in 2020 and 2021 was based on data collected from the consumer expenditure surveys for 2017 and 2018. You can find more details on the methodology on this on that same website. The latest CPI report was for July 2023, and it was released on August 10 this year. CPI for July 2023 was at 3.2 over the last 12 months, and that's a 0.2% increase from the previous month of June. Basically, what that means is compared to a year ago, it was 3.2% more expensive for the typical household in the US to pay their bills and put food on the table. Also, when someone says that inflation is going down, it doesn't mean that things are getting cheaper. It still means that things are getting more expensive, just at a slower rate. The August CPI report is supposed to be released on September 13, and I'll probably do another video specifically on inflation around that time. So why does this matter regarding the housing market? The Fed Chair Jerome Powell has stated multiple times that 2% inflation is the goal, and we are currently at 3.2 for going by the Consumer Price Index. So even though we're in a much better position compared to the CPI of July 2022, which was 9.1, I think, we are still not at the Fed's goal of 2%. So why would the Fed target a lower Fed funds rate at this time? Finally, let's go over supply and demand. We'll go over what it means and how we measure it in the housing market, as well as the local housing supply and the U.S. housing supply. The law of supply and demand combines two fundamental economic principles, and one is the law of supply and the other is the law of demand. It describes how changes in the price of a product, commodity, or resource affect its supply and demand. The law of supply is based on the supplier's or the seller's point of view. In the housing market, this would be current homeowners who are looking to sell and home builders. What the law of supply says is that everything else being equal, all factors being the same, as the price of a good or service increases, the quantity, the number of that good or service that suppliers offer will increase, and vice versa. So basically, the more consumers are willing to pay for something, the more that suppliers are willing to produce that good or service. And we see this in the housing market. 2021 saw prices of single-family homes skyrocket. Big builders like D.R. Horton, Lennar, KB Homes, Poulton Homes, they started building new communities everywhere. This graph, courtesy of Investopedia, demonstrates the relationship between price and supply. So at price P1, suppliers produce quantity Q1. At price P2, suppliers produce quantity Q2. And at price P3, suppliers produce quantity Q3. And all this is because due to price increasing for a given good or service, they are financially incentivized to increase production, and this increases quantity of that good and service, and therefore supply. The supply curve is upward sloping. This is because over time, suppliers can choose how much of their goods to produce and later bring to market. Now, this is like, in a vacuum, this is a perfect market. Real life is a lot messier. This is from the Federal Reserve Economic Data, or FRED website. Looking at new construction starts, which FRED defines as when excavation begins for the footings or foundations of a building, we can see that the number of new privately owned housing units exceeded pre-pandemic numbers several times. If you ask business owners, for many of them, 2019 was their best year up to that point in time. So why are we looking at this graph? Well, those prices were more than enough incentive for builders, like home builders, to ramp up production. Now let's talk about the law of demand. The law of demand is from the consumer's or the buyer's perspective. Regarding the housing market, this would be home buyers. The law of demand states that as prices increase, consumers will demand a lower quantity of a given good or service. Let's say that your go-to custom, overpriced drink at Starbucks is just under $10. You treat yourself to this maybe twice a week. Now let's say your drink is all of a sudden over $11, and it's actually closer to $12 than it is to $11. Are you still going to be going to Starbucks twice a week? This is the another graph courtesy of Investopedia, and this shows the relationship between price and demand. And unlike the supply curve, the demand curve is downward sloping. So as price decreases for a good or service, demand increases for said good or service. At price P1, consumers will demand quantity Q1. At price P2, consumers will demand quantity Q2, and as it decreases to price P3, the quantity demanded will be Q3. We can see the law of demand in action in the housing market. And this is the housing report for July 2023, courtesy of the Greater McAllen Association of Realtors. For the McAllen Edinburg Mission MSA, Metropolitan Statistical Area, that's what MSA means, median price went up 2.2% year over year to 235,000, while the number of closed sales went down 4.5% to 320. For the city of McAllen alone, the median price went up 6.3% to 255,000. This is year over year once again. But the number of closed sales went down by 30.8% to 63 in July. And once again, another graph courtesy of Investopedia, and it illustrates the law of supply and demand. Supply is the blue line, demand is the orange line, and the point at which they intersect is the equilibrium price. At this point, the price is where demand matches supply. This produces a market equilibrium that is acceptable to buyers and sellers. There's no surplus supply or unmet demand. For the housing market, typically we consider 6 months of inventory to be a neutral market. So you could probably say that for an area, when it's at 6 months of inventory, the median price of a single family home in that area is the equilibrium price for that area. And we'll talk more about months of inventory later. The supply curve and the demand curve, they can shift left or right depending on whether they are increasing or decreasing, and a shift in either curve affects price. Currently, I think the housing market is due for a correction. It's just personal opinion. In some metros like Austin, that correction has already started. Supply is low, but prices and demand are high. You could even argue that demand and therefore price were artificially inflated. I'm one of those people making that argument. Once again, a personal opinion. But like many people making the same argument, I point to the lockdowns, the money printing in 2020 and 2021, the artificially low rates of the decade prior to 2022, among other things. I could probably make a whole video on why I think the housing market is artificially inflated. I know several other YouTubers have, and probably will make a video addressing that as well. Alright, this graph is generated from data from my local MLS, or multiple listing services. The time frame is from July 2018 to August 2023. The data sets are broken up by month. The property is single family residences, and the area that I set to is basically all of Hidalgo County. And we're looking at median sale price, the green line, and number of sales, which is the blue line. And you can see here, summer 2021, where is it? Right there, summer 2021, right there and right there, where the lines move in opposite directions. This also happens in spring 2022 as well as spring 2023. So real estate prices don't only go up. That may be the case if you're like thinking long term, like 10, 20, 30 years. But let's say you're forced to sell a house that you overpaid for when you've only lived in it a couple of years. What if you had only put 3.5% down? You could be underwater on your mortgage if house prices and therefore home values have dropped. What if you actually have to bring money to the closing table in order to even sell your home? Like, well, you have that money. Have you considered the possibility of being forced to do a short sale, or even worse, like having a foreclosure? I'm not trying to scare you, just trying to warn you about the risk that could occur if you overpay for a home. Now, in real estate, we measure months of supply or months of inventory by taking the number of active listings and dividing it by the number of sold listings for that month. So if 1 month, a total of 100 listings, or there was a total of 100 active listings, and 20 of those listings sold that month, then the months of supply would be 5. Because at that rate, it would take 5 months to sell all of that current inventory. Months of supply is a way to measure both supply and demand in the housing market. 6 months of inventory, like I said earlier, is considered a neutral market. 5 months or less is a seller's market, which favors the sellers, and 7 months or more is a buyer's market, favoring buyers. For the McAllen Edinburg Mission MSA, the month of supply for July 2023 was 4.9. For Texas, for July, it was 3, and for the U.S. as a whole, it was 2. And the official housing report for the Greater McAllen for August of this year will likely be released next week. Lastly, I want to mention other factors that influence market trends and therefore price. They are government, international transactions, and speculation and expectation. Now, again, this is a personal opinion, but I think that all three of these have played a bigger role than they should have regarding the current state of the housing market. Well, that's it. So to repeat, I guess the thesis of this video, unemployment, inflation, and supply and demand, among other factors, are all things that shape the housing market. Hope you got something out of this video. Like, share, and subscribe. Bye.